Welcome back, motorized bike enthusiast. In today's video, we've paired the Screaming Demon bicycle from bicycleengines.com with the Southern Custom CC's hybrid motor so we can test them together. This will be an update on the hybrid and our first impressions on the Screaming Demon. So let's get this bike out onto the road and I'll rejoin you guys in just a few moments. So we took the bike for a 20-mile round trip and there was no show-stopping issues along the way. But it wasn't exactly a smooth ride. Starting with the motor, it ran great, though the tune is a little on the rich side just to be safe because these Minarellis run so hot, especially when you're cruising, that dealing with seizures is something that gets old really fast. We didn't have any of those today and the motor had no problems. As expected, and we've mentioned many times before, this motor has ample power. Way more power than I feel is safe for this frame to handle. We'll get into that more in a little bit. Being that it's a new build and I'm not crazy about top speed, I only gave it a few quick pulls and it had plenty of power, so we're not worried about that. I noticed an interesting difference with the dynamic of the pipes on these two different builds. Now on my F0, my first Minarelli build, I'm using a jog pipe, and on this bike I'm using the MZ65. Both bikes are set up very similar with a stock Minarelli cylinder, 36.2 sprocket, and 26-inch wheels. With the jog pipe, I found that I can cruise at pretty much any speed, low to high, with the motor running stable and smooth at all RPM ranges. But with the MZ65, it does not like to cruise at low RPMs. However, the trade-off is, in the mid-range, the MZ65 has quite a bit more power than the jog pipe. They tend to both taper off at about the same power when you get into the higher RPMs, but I noticed once you hit about 4,500 on the MZ65, there is a big difference in power. Unfortunately, because it doesn't like to run at low RPMs, this is a bit of a problem for me, as a lot of times I like to cruise around 28 to 30 miles an hour, and this bike seems to want to cruise at 35 at the minimum. So something that's good to keep in mind, if you're like me and you like to cruise around at random RPMs without the motor jerking the bike all over the place, you might consider going with the jog pipe, as it just seems to run a bit smoother. However, if you're someone who's going to be ripping on and off the throttle and you want a lot of that mid-range pull without sacrificing the top end, the MZ65 is probably going to be the way to go. In our first test ride with this Southern Customs hybrid motor, I noticed a tiny bit of slipping on the clutch. Not really enough to complain about, just enough to notice. However, in today's ride, for some reason every time I gunned the throttle, I couldn't feel it slip at all. I'm not sure if this just has something to do with the pads wearing in, but it does have a smaller sprocket, and in my mind, a smaller sprocket would usually cause the clutch to slip more because the motor's under more of a load. So kudos to Southern Custom for getting that preload spring worked out nicely. This kind of puts a kink in my plans for testing DLH's budget clutch. I was originally going to put that on the 110 motor for our daily driver since it had some clutch slipping issues, but the shaft on the magneto side broke off, so that motor's dead. I'll just have to figure something else out for testing the budget clutch. As a bit of a side note, I figured out a way to fix these defective trigger lock clutch levers with a bit of a hack. Essentially, I just took some quick steel epoxy putty and molded an extension onto the trigger lock and then carved a notch into it so it would stop at the proper position. There's probably much better ways to do this, but this was a quick and easy fix and it's pretty solid. Now, one last thing for the hybrid, which is otherwise running fantastic with plenty of power, is the vibrations really starting to get to me. If any of you guys pick up one of these motors in the future, please come back and let me know in the comments how smooth yours is running, because mine doesn't run very smooth in any RPM range. Now, I've been told that when you balance these cranks, you can't get them perfect and you have to balance them to try and target a certain RPM range. Well, if that's the case on this motor, I don't know what that range is because it's running with a lot of vibration down low, in the middle, and up top. However, when I balanced my crank on the first hybrid, I noticed it runs smooth in every RPM range that I run it in. So I don't know how much truth there is to that or what I'm missing, but then again, I don't push my motors above 10K. Now on to the bike. The Screaming Demon was a pretty straightforward and easy build. A little fein dangling with the rear brake to get it adjusted just right, but I do appreciate rim brakes, just not on mag rims. And this being the first bike I've ever run with mag rims, you notice it right away, especially on my rough roads. You tend to feel every little tiny bump in the road with these mag rims. Not a big fan. And one of the big bonuses of having mag rims that I always assumed was the fact that they would run true from the factory, as you can't true them if they don't. Well, unfortunately, there's a little bit of wobble in our rear wheel. It's definitely not true, so that's unfortunate. Though there is a plus with these mag rims, as they use sealed bearings and they don't have cup and cone bearings. This makes them easier to adjust, and in theory, the bearings should last much longer because they're sealed so dirt and debris won't get inside. Now, the Screaming Demon frame is aluminum, just like the F-Zero. But unfortunately, unlike the F-Zero, the chainstay, seat stay, and tank tube are not particularly thick. You notice it while riding, and you can see it. There's a lot of flex in this frame, and flex is bad for aluminum. For this reason, I would recommend staying away from high-performance motors on this bike. Look at this bike as more of a convenience but not a performance build, as I personally don't think it's capable of handling the stresses that these high-performance motors will produce for very long. I would stick with a YD100 at the most, but ideally I would stay with a China doll. 6680cc motors will shine on this frame. It's important to remember that just because it's a gas bike frame doesn't mean you can stick whatever you want on this thing. However, for what it is, the build quality seems nice. I don't have any issues with the weld or the build overall. It's just important to keep in mind its limitations. And luckily, mine didn't leak. An important thing to note about these frames with the built-in lower motor mount is how you mount the motor. And thanks to an old video from Zeda Motorsports, I was able to take care of this before it became an issue. You don't want to just blindly mount the motor to this frame. You first want to mount it to the lower motor mount so it sits flush and level with that mount. And then on the rear mount, you want to add washers or as many spacers as you need to take up the excessive space. Because if you don't take up this space and you pull the motor towards the seat tube, you can cause stress and cracks in the lower motor mount of the frame itself. Other builders have even suggested cutting this mount off completely and using a CNC mount. But for me, I'm going to try this method and see how it holds up. The welds on the mount itself look solid, so I'm banking on this not being an issue. To sum up my thoughts about this build is I probably won't be keeping the Southern Customs Hybrid on it for long. That motor is going to need a stronger build. I'll probably be using this frame as my test platform for China Doll motors and G4 cylinder port work so we can get back into the porting and performance series very soon. That series was a lot of fun. I still have many more modifications to try, and a lot of viewers have asked me to continue it, so I don't have a problem with that. So I hope you got some useful information out of today's video, or at the very least were mildly entertained. And until next time, ride safe.